One of the most popular and enduring fantasy series of all time is finally making its way into our screens, and I was lucky enough to see the first 2 episodes at the world premiere. This is my review of The Wheel of Time. Set in a high fantasy world where magic exists but only some can access it, a woman named Moiraine crosses paths with 5 young men and women, one of whom is prophesied to be the Dragon Reborn, the person who will either destroy or save humanity. Now, before I properly start with my review, I want you to let me know your thoughts on The Wheel of Time. If you're a fan of the books, if you're a newbie like me, anything and everything down there in the comments below. If you love to talk about movies and TV, this is the place to be, so consider clicking the subscribe button if you enjoy what you see here. Without any further ado, for context, I never read the books. They were just too overwhelming to me, the thickness of them, but I'm also a fantasy nut. Anything high fantasy, I will be there day one, and luckily Amazon had me over at the world premiere with the cast and a few of the producers, and I've always been intrigued about this show. So coming into this, not having any idea what the books are actually about, what the story is actually about, I will say that the first episode can be a bit overwhelming. It just throws you right in, and it feels like it's looking for a balance, rightfully so, between welcoming new fans and just getting straight to business for people who are familiar with the books. And so those first 20 to 30 minutes of the opening episode can be a bit overwhelming. You're just being shown and thrown into everything. The story's already going, you're meeting all these new characters, and you're not familiar, I'm not familiar, obviously, with the notions and the ideals and the themes of the show, so everything can just feel a bit too much. But then the back half of that first episode really settles down, and you're allowed to spend time with these characters and get to know them a little bit. You get to meet Moiraine, of course, played by the wonderful Rosamund Pike, and the rest of the cast is actually really great as well. Zoe Robbins is in this show. I personally know her from being one of the Power Rangers on Power Rangers Ninja Steel. So I'm immediately gravitating towards someone I know. But by the end of this episode, where shit hits the fan without any spoilers, really the 2 characters that stood out the most to me are Matt and Perrin, played by Barney Harris and Marcus Rutherford. I find Matt and Perrin's struggles and what stands in their way and how they're thrust upon this journey to find their hidden potential the most promising. And that's why those 2 stand out to me. But Egwene and Rand are interesting. I'm not a big fan of Rand thus far. He makes some interesting character choices. He says a lot of things that I like, but then he doesn't act accordingly. Moiraine and Lan are that couple. They are not actually a couple, but you just fall in love with them because they're so mysterious right now. They're taking no bullshit, they're wasting no time, they're here for a mission, and they're very professional about it, and they're here to try and save the world by finding out who these 4, which one of them is the Dragon Reborn. But as always, Rosamund Pike, who is also a producer on the show, she's awesome. She is incredible. She brings a lot of gravitas to the show. Not only when she's when she's talking about the mission and about the legends and about the Aes Sedai, which is just a really interesting notion that I still don't know a lot about. So hopefully in the upcoming episodes. But even the action sequences, she keeps everything very grounded just because of her level of quality of performance. First episode is overwhelming a bit for someone who is new to this show, to this franchise, to this series. It's also a lot of building. It's doing a lot of world building. It's doing a lot of just presenting the ideas, the starting points. It doesn't really get going with the actual story until the end, which I think it's alright. But I'm also very glad I didn't just see the first episode, and luckily I was shown the second one, because the second episode of this show really gets going. This is where the story just flows. The entire episode is progression from beginning to end. And though I cannot talk about a lot of things in the second episode, there's a ton of character in there, tons of character progression and the dynamics playing off of one another. You start seeing as our lead group of characters go on this journey, and everything just starts to get to them a little bit. The events of the first episode, of the ending of the first episode, really affect them. And you start to see how this big life change really gets them psychologically, which I really appreciated seeing, because it's an incredible change in the status quo of people's lives. And so I like that this is not an easy change for these characters. And the second episode not only does a good job with the characters, but it also expands the world from what we already established in the first episode. We get presented to a certain faction of characters that are clearly bad guys. And they're gonna, I'm assuming, gonna have a big role to play in this story. But I got to admit, those costumes are the coolest thing I have ever seen in anything. They're called the White Cloaks, I believe. That's all I can say right now. They're ruthless. They're very scary. They bring a lot of intimidation into proceedings, but they have the coolest costumes I've ever seen in anything. So overall, these first two episodes really bring you into the world. For new fans, it can feel kind of overwhelming, but stick with those first episodes and the second episode really gets going. That is just a lot of progression, where by the end of the second episode, you're in a completely different place than you were in the beginning. So the status quo is changing not only for the characters, but for us, the audience, which makes things very exciting. But like I said, in that first hour, it can feel very overwhelming, but then once you get acquainted with these characters, and as little things happen in a big action sequence where Moiraine gets to kick some ass and other characters get to do some other things, but there's a big moment where everyone gasped in the audience in the first episode, and once you see it, you'll know what I mean. My biggest cons so far is that I feel overall the show hasn't found its true identity. It's a fantasy show that looks great, by the way. The way they capture these landscapes, the big swooping shots across the forests and wherever they're traveling, the big cities, really interesting visually locations, but I still need to see the grand picture. I still need to see the forest, not just the trees. I think this is well on its way so far to become something really special, to become one of Amazon's biggest, if not biggest show thus far. And again, I will always be there to watch any fantasy thing, anything with magic and beasts and set in medieval times. This is right up my alley. I really like some of these characters. I'm really intrigued by where they're going. The show is doing a slow but really good job at building its world little by little. But again, I need the show to become its own thing and not something that I recognize this from other fantasy shows or fantasy movies. But by far my biggest disappointment so far, and I hope it gets better as we move on the show, are the action sequences. There's a dichotomy in the first episode that I really like what they were going for, where everything is very static, everything is very peaceful. The show has these really slow moving pans and very static camera shots where you can just see everything very wide open. But then when the action kicks in and shit hits the fan, it's just shaky cam, lots of cuts and close-ups after close-ups after close-ups, and it just gets very chaotic and visually confusing. I cannot catch myself, I cannot catch what I was looking at, which really relates to the first half of the premiere episode where, okay, I'm just being presented to everything and it's just a bit too chaotic, and then it's chaotic on a visual level, where I still haven't gotten acquainted enough to the geography of Two Rivers, the town, and then just, I don't know what I'm looking at, because the action is set at night. And you want to see these battles, you want to see swordsmen fighting and using their swords or bow and arrows, or you want to see the action. And the action is just not very well shot. It's not even the kind of shaky cam a la Paul Greengrass that does it really well, in my opinion, in the Bourne movies. But it's just very cut, shake, 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 and it cuts from close-ups to close-ups constantly, so you're never able to figure out what you're looking at for the most part. So the action really leaves something to be desired. Is really a sting in this show this far, and I hope it gets better moving forward. I will be watching the rest of the season soon, and I will bring you reviews for those. But these first 2 episodes, the first one is a bit shaky, where the back half is stronger than the first half. Then the second one, I was really, okay, I'm into this. There's story progression, there's character progression, things are moving forward at a constant pace, and the status quo and the notions of the characters, their worldviews are constantly being challenged. So I am into this show. I am into this journey right now, at least for the first season. Who knows if I'll hit the rest, but right now I'm very much into this. Overall, the show does a good job at showing us a fantasy world with a lot of great world building and really interesting characters. Again, there's a lot of intrigue in those relationships and how the dynamics keep working. So I don't know if it changes anything, and if it does, I don't know what it changes. I've heard rumblings that one of my favorite characters, Perrin, was a little bit different in the books. I don't want to know how different he is, but it's just something I noticed and overheard people talking at the screener. So once again, I'm not going to rate this, by the way. I'm not going to rate this right now because I've only seen 2 episodes. It wouldn't be fair. But as a fantasy nut, I'm curious. I'm curious to see the rest, so I want to know what you think. If you're hyped for the show, if you're familiar at all with the books, if you're not, anything and everything, just go down there in the comments and start the conversation, because it's the most important part. And so yeah, those are my thoughts on The Wheel of Time, the first 2 episodes thus far. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the show. I hope you come around for the rest of the reviews for each episode, and I hope to see you very soon whenever I upload the next one. So until then, love each other and love the movies.